Nations Platform on Artificial Intelligence. Organized by the International Telecommunication Union, the United Nations Agency for Digital Technologies, in partnership with over 50 UN agencies, and co-convened with Switzerland. The mission of AI for Good is to unlock AI's potential to serve humanity. As a multi-stakeholder platform, AI for Good advances solutions, standards, and skills. In today's AI for Good event, we are counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging session. Boost your AI skills and elevate your career with the AI for Good Discovery Badge. Receive verified digital credentials that recognize your engagement in cutting-edge sessions, exploring how AI is being used to tackle global challenges. To see if a session is eligible, look for the blue badge banner on the right side of the video interface that activates at the end of each live session. Share your badge on LinkedIn and across your professional profiles, and check the AI for Good events webpage for upcoming eligible online sessions. Discovery Badge sessions are part of the AI Skills Coalition, ITU's global initiative to strengthen credible AI learning pathways and expand access to high-quality, trustworthy AI knowledge worldwide. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished facilitators and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you to all of you for being with us today, as well as our distinguished panelists. We're here today to explore where different regions in the world stand in their journey towards governing AI, especially when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, the disclosure of AI-generated content, and the different ways governments are addressing intellectual property, copyright issue, to help to protect the livelihood of human content creators. So it's a big topic. I'm Alessandra Sala, Senior Director of AI and Data Science at Shutterstock, and also the chair of the AI and Multimedia Authenticity Standard Collaboration, a global multi-stakeholder initiative led by the World Standard Cooperation, including IEC, ISO, and ITU. And thank you for the AI for Good for hosting us today. These initiatives brings together standard developers, technology leaders, academic expert, policymaker, startup, and civil society to examine the technical policy and broader societal implication of rebuilding trust in digital content. And today, I'm joined with Nieleng Morosi to co-chair with me, moderate with me, these panelists of experts. So please, Nieleng, introduce yourself and then we'll kick off this interesting discussion.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Alessandra. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm Nieleng Morosi. I'm a research fellow at the Distributed AI Research and a co-founder of the Deep Learning in Java, and I've also been an advisor to the safety lab, which actually many of the individuals who are going to be the AI safety lab, which many of the individuals who are going to be introducing today actually come from. So first of all, I'm going to go through our great panelists. I'm going to introduce each one of them. So first, we've got Ms. Julian Tang. Ms. Julian is an engineer at the Internet Law Center in China. She has also done research for the ITU. She primarily is a governance researcher. She's going to be talking to us about some of the work that they've been doing at both the ITU and the Law Center. Second up is Professor Ravindran. He's is the head of the Vadvani School of Data Science and AI at the IIT Madras in India. Next, we have Mr. Alan Shiboy, who is the Data and Digital Technology Lead at Builder, and has been one of the finalists at the UNDP Tri-Stone Safety Reimagination Lab that I mentioned earlier. Finally, we have Mr. Daniel Odongo, the director of Ushahidi, Director of Technology at Ushahidi. He also was one of the finalists for us at the Reimagination Lab. So these are the finalists. We're going to go through one at a time with Alessandra, and each one of these finalists each one of the panelists are going to introduce themselves in a little bit more detail. So to start, I'm going to ask Professor Ravirandan to introduce himself and to just give us some introductory remarks about what he thinks about these topics of policy and regulation and intervention from his region, and region meaning geographical region.
Thank you, Naila, and thank you. I also joined in the co-chairs in thanking AI for Good for hosting this very important discussion. So I am Ravindran. I am a faculty at IIT Madras, but I've also been involved in a lot of the policy discussions at the Indian government level, AI policy discussions at the Indian government level. And so I can tell you a little bit about the stance that India has taken with regard to governing AI. Right? So the first thing that in our governance guidelines says is that a lot of regulatory structure that has been already in operation for various sectors and controlling various kinds of harms, including the IT Act of India, as well as the various sectoral, financial, healthcare regulators, etc., etc. So the first order of business is to try to understand how introduction of AI challenges these existing regulatory frameworks. So it's not a question of we are trying to legislate something from scratch, right? So there are a lot of harms, a lot of issues that are kind of amplified by AI. There are mechanisms for addressing them within the existing infrastructure. So the first thing is to understand that, have sectoral regulators, come out with recommendations, education, programs. For example, we want to make sure the law enforcement officers and the people in the judicial system understand, hey, when do the current AI laws, when do the current regulations apply, and when do we have to take a second look at it, and so on and so forth. So that's one recommendation that we've very strongly taken, and so that various sectoral regulators are each coming out with their own guidelines now as to how to enforce things in the area of AI. And the second thing is that there are gaps, right? So it's not that AI is not introducing new challenges. So what are the gaps, and how do we identify them, and how do we kind of address them, right? So one of the easiest thing, at least for us to do, the first step that the government has taken, is to make it mandatory for to be very, very transparent when you are interacting with an AI or when you are looking at AI content, right? So AI content labeling has been made mandatory, and also the upfront declaration that you're interacting with an AI. So what is still challenging is how do we enforce it? How do you tie the liability if somebody doesn't follow through on these? These are very challenging questions, and there are a lot of debate that's going on. And also to come to the other point about for the discussion on the copyright place, we are still getting our act together. India doesn't have a recommendation yet as to how to handle copyright with regard to AI. We'll probably get more input as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ravidran. Brilliant opening to our follow-up discussion. Now I'd like to pass it to Alan Shiboy for his introductory remarks.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, and it's really a pleasure to be part of this important conversation. So just to talk a little bit about my work. So I currently work at the intersection of peace building and technology, which most of the time involves assessing how digital harms relate to AI, conflict, information integrity, and all the span of things that affect peace and conflict analysis. I work for an organization called Build Up, which is an international non-profit organization which supports peace building organizations, civil society, governments in trying to understand and respond to emerging digital threats. Part of that work that we are really proud of at the moment is we recently developed like an open source social media analysis toolkit called Phoenix. which many of our partners use to conduct social media analysis. And this is after, as you know, Meta shut down CrowdTangle, and tools to do social media analysis are really, really expensive. So we decided to build this open source platform that people who are doing work for the good of the world can be able to basically access data and do analysis. And this project was the one that was selected for the UNDP AI Trust and Safety Reimagination Lab as part of the cohort. And we are really excited about how that is going. So aside from that, much of the work that I do is in Africa, in the African context. And of course, the risks around synthetic media that we are going to be discussing today is not unique, right? It's not unique to the continent, not unique to any part of the world. It's quite similar. And we've also seen synthetic media being used to shape elections, to influence the public in one way or another. And in some cases, and because I work a lot on looking at conflict and peace building, we've seen that an emergence of use of synthetic media in conflict situations in Sudan, in Nigeria. We're starting to see emergence of such. I'm currently based in Kenya, and I just wanted to contextualize, because we just recently heard from the government that there is an AI bill that was being floated for discussion. It's currently going through public participation and legislative discussions in Parliament. But the interesting thing is that there seems to be a clear recognition of the opportunities that AI present, but also the risks that come with it within this bill. So it's still in draft, not yet implemented, but it's quite interesting. And this is, for a country like Kenya, quite a step ahead. One of the things I wanted to highlight specifically when I looked at that bill was they kind of had an establishment of an AI governance structure, which included an office for AI advisory, basically, which is an artificial intelligence commission that advises on how Kenya will implement different things in relation to AI, both from a coordination or oversight perspective. But the most interesting bit for me is that it also introduces a risk-based classification process of AI systems, which means that there's a recognition that not all AI has the same level of risk, which is quite important, especially when it comes to discussions around synthetic media and the harms and opportunities that come with it. There's one of the other things that I noticed specifically for that specific bill is that there's also a recognition on it requires organizations, once it's passed, to be able to provide transparency information, which is quite interesting, traceability and then explainability of AI systems, which means it's more aligned to a lot of global conversations that we are discussing around providence, around standards for tracing synthetic media and content. So I feel like that is quite a strong foundation that would really shape a lot of what we see. But generally, what I see in Africa is most of the countries are still relying on cybercrime laws, data protection frameworks, and other broader laws and policies that focus on misinformation and disinformation. As we know, these laws are important, but most of them are often not designed specifically for AI-generated content, and especially on addressing synthetic media. So that's something that we kind of are in the lookout. So for me, the questions are two things that maybe, as we discuss in these conversations, I would really like to go into a little bit deeper is, how can we move from policy frameworks into more operational processes that enable us to protect trust? And maybe also, how do we build the systems that can protect that trust, not only by doing labeling, for example, but through the life cycle of information or content from one end to another. So I'm really glad to be part of this, and back to you, Alessandra. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm muted. Thank you so much, Mr. Shibaway. Next, I invite Ms. Julian to give us a little bit of an introduction and her preliminary thoughts on these topics.
Thank you for inviting me to join today's discussion. And my name is Juyuan Tang from China, and my work focuses on artificial intelligence governance, particularly in areas of AI legislation, global governance frameworks, and technology ethics. And I'm very pleased to be here and to contribute to this topic. And I will briefly first to introduce China's approach to governing the deepfakes and the misinformation. And China has developed a multi-layered legal and policy framework that combines general laws, targeted regulations, and the technical standards to address the risks associated with AI-generated content. And at the foundational level, the laws such as civil code, cybersecurity law, data security law, and personal information protection law establishes general obligations. We're building on this foundation, and China has introduced targeted regulations, specifically addressing deep synthesis technologies. The most important one is the Internet Information Service Deep Synthesis Management Regulation, which set a clear boundary for the use of deepfake technologies. And these rules prohibit illegal uses such as impersonation or fraud and require service providers to implement measures, including real name registration, content review, data governance, and risk monitoring. And the key feature of China's approach is the strong emphasis on content labeling as a core governance tool. While the 2025 AI generative synthesis content labeling measures require that the AI-generated content to be clearly identified. While the labeling system operates on two levels, explicit labeling and implicit labeling. While the explicit labeling, such as the visible text, watermarks, or audio prompts, especially for the content that may mislead the public, while implicit labeling is embedded in metadata to support traceability and accountability. Well, importantly, these requirements apply across the entire content life cycle, from the content generation, creation, and platform distribution to the user sharing. Well, in addition, China has introduced mandatory national technical standards to support these rules, specifying how labeling should be implemented in practice and promoting what is often described as technology-based governance. So in summary, China's approach to deepfakes and misinformation is characterized by three elements: clear legal obligations, platform-based governance responsibilities, and a strong emphasis on standardized labeling and traceability mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you, Yugan. Very comprehensive overview. And you have referred to a number of different regulations as our panelists before. If you want to add them in the chat for our audience, so if they want to go in a little bit more details, they know which specific framework you are referring to. So thank you very much. And it's time now to introduce our final panelist of the day, Daniel Odongo. Please, your 2 minutes remark.
Thank you very much. An appreciation to AI Good, AI for Good for convening these panelists for this discussion, including myself. My name is Daniel Odongo. I'm the Director of Technology at Ushahidi, and I'm also part of the AI Governance Alliance at the World Economic Forum. At Ushahidi, we build civic technology that helps communities, civil society, journalists, and institutions to be able to collect and organize and also make sense of information from the ground, particularly in elections, crisis response, public accountability, but also public participation. And I think this work is what gives us a very practical lens on AI and media authenticity. In many of the contexts where Ushahidi is working, this is not just a question of content moderation or even platform policy. It's a question of trust, safety, and decision-making, especially in environments where information is moving very quickly through messaging apps and local languages, where the harm from manipulated or misleading content can actually be immediate. From an African perspective, the policy landscape is moving, but a bit unevenly. At a continental level, for example, the African Union's Continental AI Strategy, which was endorsed in July 2024, is an important signal that African governments actually want an AI future that is ethical, inclusive, and shaped by African priorities, rather than being imported from elsewhere. And there's also the Malabo Convention, which came in effect in 2023, which is also giving like a shared legal foundation around cybersecurity and personal data protection. So at a national level, we are starting to see more recognition of misinformation and deepfakes in public policy. And I think my colleague Alan mentioned the Kenyan example, for example, where there's policing now coming in place around this. But the more important question that I would like us to see is whether these frameworks can actually work in the realities that many people in the global south face. Multilingual communication, there's so many languages we're speaking. There's low resourcing institutions. There's even uneven enforcement capacity that we are seeing. And I think this is where Ushaidi's perspective comes in. We've learned over the years that trust is not built by technology alone, but whether people can actually report what they're seeing, and suspicious content can be checked or contextualized, or whether the institutions actually have credible ways to respond. So I'm glad to bring that practical Global South perspective into this discussion today. Not just about how we are defining authenticity, but how we make authenticity, accountability, and public trust to work in environments where the risks are highest and response capacity is actually often constrained. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Danielle. Thank you to all of us. Yes, those were really good setup for the next questions. So we're going to go through a series of questions. First of all, I'm going to address this question to Julian and Daniel. And this is about fair use and licensing models. So across your regions, do you see any fair use and licensing frameworks that apply to training data? Are they detectable? Do you think they are detectable? Do you think they are enforceable? So I do have to warn you, this is a pretty lengthy question, but we can go at it piece by piece. So are they detectable? Do they exist? Are they enforceable? How have the courts and the policymakers navigated this space, navigated these tensions? And then, of course, how are all of these players in this space navigating this international corporations, which sometimes cannot be held responsible in specific countries because of jurisdiction or because of market power? So overall, is this idea of what is, I would actually even love it if someone could even just a little bit say, what is fair use, at least as a legal concept? What does it mean if a piece of data is fair use? So fair use data, licensing about it, jurisdiction about it, how do we make sure that everybody is in compliance? And how do all the players, the policymakers, the courts navigate in this space? Julian, you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you. I'd be very happy to share the perspective from China on this question. And as to the detectability and enforceability of the fair use and licensing framework, I would say that in China, the legal enforceability is becoming clearer, while the technical detectability is improving but still remains limited. Because like to the legal side, in 2023, China adopted the interim measures for the management of generative AI services, which required service providers to use data from lawful sources and not to infringe the IP rights, and required companies to fulfill a model filing process, where when companies go through the model filing or compliance review, they are expected to disclose the legality of their data sources, as well as their content filtering mechanisms and labeling rules and other measures to ensure the dataset safety. So apart from this, and China also built a more detailed compliance standard. For example, the national standard on security requirements for generative AI training data requires companies to identify and manage major IP risks in training data, establish complaint and reporting channels, and adopt filtering mechanisms for potentially infringing content across different data modalities. So from this regulatory perspective, this is not just a broad policy statement anymore. It is gradually becoming an enforceable compliance framework. Well, on the technical side, we can see there are many tools are developing, like the multimodal fingerprinting, model watermarking, but these works are not widely used right now in China, and we still have China, and the trace the very large complex data sets remains very difficult in the practice. So generally speaking, that in China, enforceability is moving faster than the detectability. And as to the tension between the fair use and licensing, China is still trying to strike a balance between the protecting right holders and the persuading room for the AI development. Unlike the United States, China does not have an open-ended fair use doctrine. Its copyright exceptions follow a closed list approach, and AI training is not expressly listed as one of those exceptions right now. So at the statutory level, the issue is still unsettled. However, in the judicial practice, Chinese courts have shown more flexibility. What we can see is that a differentiated approach. The courts tend to be relatively more tolerant toward the training stage uses, but more cautious when it comes to the outputs and downstream uses of AI-generated content. So Chinese courts are trying to strike this balance by avoiding imposing overly burdensome obligations on AI developers, while at the same time protecting the interests of the creators. And as the question on the international bypass and the market-based licensing, I would say like two things. On the one hand, we are not yet seeing the large-scale explicit regulatory arbitrage as a fully formed business model. On the other hand, the conditions for it are clearly emerging. We increasingly see the models trained in one jurisdiction while deployed in another and commercialized across several others. Once that happens, questions of jurisdiction, evidence, and enforcement become much more complicated. So I would say that this issue is less about obvious evasion today and more about the fact that the global model development already creates the conditions for regulatory arbitrage. Its differences across jurisdictions continue to widen. For example, between the more permissive approaches in some countries and the more licensing-centered approaches in others, then the training location may become a more strategic choice for the companies. And as to the last question for the licensing, in China, the market for copyright licensing of AI training data is still at a very early stage because just as I mentioned before, the legal status of AI training is still not fully settled, and the basis for licensing negotiations remain uncertain. There's still no consensus yet on the pricing standards for massive training datasets. So for now, China is still in a stage of institutional exploration and dialogue rather than a mature market-based licensing system. So to sum up on this question, in China, compliance obligations are becoming more clearer. The technological detection is improving, but remains limited, and the courts are more flexible on the training inputs rather than the outputs. So the licensing is increasingly discussed, but not yet become the dominant model in China. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Can we hear from Daniel? Daniel, I don't know if you're aware of this. There is a new licensing that came out called the Noodle licensing from the Masakani people, the African, right? I don't know if you want to maybe also add that into your response about what the state of the licensing and how practical they are and enforceable they are, and also their interaction with international players. I hope the sound is better now. Looks better. Everybody's nodding. Great.
Great. Thank you very much, Nyaleng, and as well appreciating the input that Julian has given from the China perspective. So I think I'll start by saying the issue that I see is actually not whether fair use or licensing exists in law. And I think the real issue is actually whether these frameworks are detectable, enforceable, or actually fair in practice. And I think right now, enforcement is the weak point. So at a policy level, Africa is moving For example, I mentioned before, there's the Continental AI Strategy, and that's pushing for, being ethical and accountable. There's the Malabo Convention that is now in full force. And Kenya, for example, has also come up with an AI strategy I think from 2025 to 2030, which flags risks from Gen AI, like deepfakes, and we've even seen the country, revise the national government communication strategy, and they're explicitly naming misinformation, disinformation, and deepfakes as current governance challenges. So when you ask about whether fair use and licensing are technically enforceable, my honest answer there is that it's only partial and often very weak. So we've seen initiatives, I think like Nyaleng, you've mentioned the Masakane community, and we've also seen the Dodo license. And what's happening in there is that we're trying to see, and I say we because I'm part of these communities, we're trying to see that there are protections for local publishers, the local community radio archive, the civic reporting platform like Ushahidi, or even the fact that there's a local language knowledge base that is being scraped and then used to train a model outside that jurisdiction. Most African institutions do not yet have the technical or legal capacity to even prove that this content has been taken from you. You can't even prove where it's being used. And basically, you don't even have an awareness of what remedies should follow. So that is the core enforcement gap. And I say again, the law may exist, but tracing the model inputs across borders is going to be very difficult right now for us. We have seen data protection acts like in Kenya and in South Africa that are giving people, rights and remedies over personal data. And I think South Africa in particular has, a coverage around biometric information, including voice recognition, which actually matters for AI voice cloning. But those are stronger for privacy claims than for actually proving that the model trained on your data at scale has done so without permission. So there's lots of constraints that we are still seeing. So just about the bit around market-based licensing, sadly, the best examples we are seeing are coming from the global. So Shutterstock, for example, has a deal with OpenAI around this. We've also seen Financial Times do the same, Adobe do the same. And this is covering mostly public domain material, but not scraped user content. And these are attractive because they are cleaner, more legible, easier to defend. And I think they argue based off broad fair use theories after the fact. But my concern that I would like to highlight is that this licensing is working for only actors who are already visible in the market. So these are the big publishers, these are the large image libraries, big media houses. But what about local language communities, in very low resource communities? What about community reports that we're seeing being gathered by civil society organizations? What about grassroots documentation of, conflict or even climate? So these are valuable data sets that make AI globally useful, but the people behind them are not in a position to negotiate a training data deal. So this is part of the question we're having, that yes, there's a move towards licensing, and we're seeing that actually is going to become more dominant. But unless we pair this with transparency obligations, public interest protections, and some way of recognizing the communities and local language knowledge ecosystems, we are risking being able to see like another extractive model where value is actually coming out and there's no control or compensation by the communities generating this data. And I say from an African perspective that we might have all the privacy or cyber laws come up, but if a data set is scraped in Nairobi, but processed in another jurisdiction and folded into a model elsewhere, proving that chain in a way that leads to remedy is still extremely difficult. And that's a challenge that persists.
This panel is so comprehensive in their answers that we are moving ahead with our journey quite fast. And I want to stay one more minute on this concept of compensation, creator compensation and IP protection. Because I'm having many discussion with artists around the world, a small group of photographers or artists that are part of this very niche artistic trend. And Daniel, they are telling me exactly what you said. We don't feel we have the power or the knowledge or the tool or the access to negotiate how our content is used in AI training, and also in the creation of generative AI content, because we need to remember that there are two very different ways of compensating artists. One is when data are taken for the training, the building of the capability. The other one is when this capability is in use and it's making revenue and it's making profit. And that part of profit could be shared with those that have contributed to make that machine. And those are the concepts that Shutterstock has pioneered, and then they have been taken from the industry as a de facto standard. But the question remains. It's not about those big library of content. It's about those smaller players around the world. So the question back to you, and I like also to hear the insights from India, which is also developing this very comprehensive framework, which I have read and admired deeply. Is it a tech? Is that technology ask? Or is it a policy ask? Because implementation and enforcement could be enabled if artists or community have a way to publish their content with specific requirement. So telling the world, hey, you can use it, but if you use it, those are the conditions that we ask to be respected. And once that disclaim, it's clear, then enforcing is more feasible. So I leave the question possibly to start with Professor Ravindran, and then if we have Daniel, if you want to follow up with further consideration, and Yugan, definitely your view is very welcome.
Well, I mean, I'm going to echo a bit of what Daniel said. Right? So the challenge is, do we have, I mean, it's not just the global south. Anywhere in the world, do we have a way of proving that a specific piece of content was used in building a model? Right? Unless there is some kind of a bookkeeping trial that is being mandated in terms of how the data got ingested into building any model, right? Just by even having unlimited access to a model. It can be a published open weights model. Even then, we don't have a reliable way of establishing that a particular piece of data was used for building it, right? And even when the output of the model matches the artifact very closely, there is still room to make an argument saying that that happened because of the generalization ability of the model and not because that data point was used for training. So technically, we still don't have the tool. So it has to be more of a techno-legal kind of a framework where we have, we mandate mechanisms by which every piece of data gets tagged when it's used to build a model and things like that. And what you are asking about is that does there exist a system where you can make sure that whenever the model is used, the whole thing gets automatically tracked back to a piece of data. So there is an organization in India. This is partly more of a social welfare organization, partly a data labeling organization called Karya that has done exactly that. So they collect voice data because we have to do it for multiple languages in India. They've gone to the villages and got the data, and every villager who contributed to a specific voice file is tagged and tracked. So whenever a model that is built using that voice file, is monetized, they get a small fraction of the payment going back, and it could be as little as $15 to $20 a month going back to these people. But in many cases, because we are talking about villages in really remote parts of the country, this actually makes a difference to them. So this is something that is workable. The technology is there, but we need the supporting regulatory infrastructure. That's why I said it has to be a techno-legal solution. And in fact, thank you, Alexandra, for saying that you like India's reflection bill, because I chaired the committee that wrote the governance bill. So I'll accept the, the appreciation on their behalf. Thanks. What you did.
Yujun, do you want to come in and add a perspective from China?
Yes, thank you. And I would like to share some perspective from China about the IP protection and the creator compensation. Well, actually, in China, the framework for protection is developing faster than the licensing framework for compensation. Well, I will share you guys with some from the court points, because just as I mentioned before, the Chinese corporate law does not expressly classify AI training as a fair use. So many of these issues are still being addressed through the case-by-case judicial decisions. And the courts tend to take a differentiated approach. They are more relatively flexible when they're looking at the training stage data use, while more stricter when assessing AI-generated contents and the downstream uses of these outputs. This means that if a right holder can show that an AI-generated output is substantially similar to their work, and that the platform was at fault, the judicial remedies are available. So in this sense, the creators can obtain recognition and protection through the litigation. But just we talked before, the licensing framework, the compensation as a systematic framework is still evolving in China. Well, the judicial protection mechanisms are already in place, but the market-based and the collective approaches to compensation are still under the development. And we all know, we can see that there are some ongoing efforts to develop such mechanisms. For example, the copyright collective management organizations like the Music Copyright Society of China are actively promoting dialogue and the cooperation between the generative AI industry and the collective management bodies. They would like to establish a clearer licensing framework and royalty standards, but it's still not established yet, and still in development. And from the side of the Chinese court, and the court have generally taken the cautious approach in avoiding the damages in the AI-related copyright cases. They seek to avoid imposing excessively high damages that might unduly constrain the AI industry development, while still providing the judicial remedies where appropriate. For example, in China's Hangzhou Internet Court, there is a famous case called the Ultraman case, and the court awarded like the 30,000 yuan in economic losses and reasonable expenses. So we can see that actually the number is quite not very high, and we can see just to use to compensate. There is no punishment or other damages to fine. So in simple terms, China actually, its current approach combines judicial protection with ongoing efforts to build more systematic or market-based compensation mechanisms rather than relying solely on the one model. Thank you.
Yeah, very good, very good. Thank you very much. Daniel, do you have any very quick final point to close up this part of the discussion, given you have so eloquently opened it?
So I think I'll focus on what are the remedies, and I think there's a part around simply where do you check where a model is being used. I'll mention that there's innovations we've seen mostly at public sector level, the inventories and registries, which tell you, which model is being used by what government agency, for example, and it's searchable. And I think this is a best practice that we could borrow from, particularly for private sector model deployment. So I think that, and also looking into transparency and documentation obligations that different governments might embed within their policy making. So logging, particularly for deployers of high-risk AI systems, to just help improve that traceability inside regulated contexts. Yes,
Yeah.
that's where I'd close there.
Quickly to join backward, Daniel, it goes back to the other point that you were making. Cross-border enforcement of national regulations is just not going to fly. So that's a huge challenge for all of us.
That's very true. That's very true. It's a big challenge. And for us and our audience, an inspiration point to think about which are the possible remedies, the technology that is required to register where things can and should be used, and how to navigate this very complex topic. I'll bring it back to Nailan. For moving forward, we are getting close to the ending of this discussion, and we'd like to touch a few other interesting points.
Yeah, definitely. This is definitely one of those where it's great to just listen in and just hear these reflections. And of course, you know, these are the things that we hear about every time you're in a community of builders. You know, I appreciate the balance that Yang has been, you know, emphasizing on you want to grow the AI community, right? But on the other side also, you do need to protect specific data sets. Like here in Africa, definitely. The thing is, the data sets are not readily available online, right? This is something we know, these are prized data sets, but also the people who own them are so fragmented, as you said, Alessandra and also Daniel, that, you know, it's so difficult to get this like momentum. But hopefully with unity such as Masakane, right, it's getting bigger enough that maybe it can be a true lobbying entity, but we don't know. Mr. Shiboy, we have not heard from you. And I would love to hear from you. You work across multiple jurisdictions, somehow across multiple cultures. And this question will also be also to you, Professor Ravindran, because I have a feeling that you have also been in these conversations. And if we had longer, we would have everybody in this. But this is about the collaboration across borders, right? Like, where are the points of alignment in terms of policy, in terms of acts? Like, how do we coordinate? Obviously, we're talking about how cross-border enforcement is so difficult. This is certainly, you know, maybe this is one thing to do, but also I think as, you know, countries and entities in the global south, how do we collaborate? How do we share intelligence about what has worked? You know, in order to try to move our agenda forward. This has been a big topic, I know, from like the AI summit in India. This was a whole thing about the South to South collaboration. And so, yes, Mr. Shiboy, what have been some, or what do you think are the areas of alignment in terms of, you know, managing the harms, but also making, you know, aligning our standards and practices in order to complement one another?
Yeah, that's an important question. And as Ravindran said earlier, it's quite a complex one to answer because, you know, sharing information and basically coordinating across borders and jurisdictions is a little bit harder, not impossible, but a little bit harder. But I think there are a couple of starting points that we're already seeing that are emerging, right? And this is, for example, you know, having shared definitions of different components. You know, I was looking at, for example, different regulations that exist out there when it comes to AI regulation. And when you talk about, for example, the component of IP, in Kenya, we call it fair dealing instead of fair use. And it's quite different in terms of how that definition is as compared to, like, you know, what we have in Europe, in the US, in India. So I think just having shared definitions becomes a very important part of us going forward. So is there, like, for example, you know, a framework that can be developed to have shared definitions across multiple jurisdictions so that we both speak the same language? I think that becomes a very important component of how this cross-border collaboration starts. And then, of course, there's the component of standards that are being implemented. I think, we've seen standards working in different other contexts, in climate change, in all these other jurisdictions that traditionally were very hard to collaborate cross-border. So I think these standards that are emerging for us to be able to establish, for example, providence in terms of content or like different other things that we want to standardize, that becomes a very important entry point for us to be able to address the challenge. And then one, I think for me, I work in conflict. So there's one that I think we've been trying to kind of push forward, especially in the conflict analysis space. And this is taking an opportunity of looking at fragile contexts like conflicts and pushing through some bit of collaborative approaches. One of such is like when it comes to digital ceasefires. So for example, right now when the bombs, when there's a ceasefire, and that means the bombs are no longer dropping, that goes to the internet. Like people now start throwing, deepfakes and synthetic media saying that this is happening. And that then becomes a very huge trigger when it comes to conflict situations. And because conflicts are usually cross-border at the end of the day, management of conflicts is usually cross-border, we're taking that opportunity to basically start pushing for something called digital ceasefires as part of ceasefire agreements. And this then can translate specifically to addressing how do we have components of how, AI generated content or like content that is generated basically for harmful harmful situations on the internet, how can we integrate that conversation there and then start to see the areas where we have differences and synergies, and then identify those entry points, because of course, at the end of the day, this becomes a really important part of it. So embedding rules on, for example, AI generated content, synthetic media, and the use of such types of content in ceasefire agreements and peace negotiations becomes quite an important entry point, at least for the work that I do at the moment. So we are looking at, for example, whenever there is a ceasefire agreement being developed, how do we kind of seed in the ideas of, okay, there is also digital ceasefires, and within digital ceasefires, there's cybersecurity, but there's also AI-generated content or AI processes that could be used when it comes to these particular processes. So that I think could be an entry point, but yeah, I'd love to hear what others think in terms of like the more efficient ways to be able to do those cross-border collaborations. Yeah.
Okay. No, I just want to keep talking too much. But anyway, so that's the perils of being a professor. I just love to. So let me quickly, Alan, I just love the digital ceasefire idea. So not just because this has to something that gets aligned with actual conflict, because cyber warfare is happening every day. It's just undeclared warfare that is happening between a lot of countries, and I know that because I know that India is under cyber attack almost every day, coordinated cyber attack at a significant scale almost every day, and this whole notion of cyber ceasefire really speaks to that. I love that. So one thing I wanted to get back to the Impact Summit, AI Impact Summit that happened. So Nailang happened to bring it up. There were several multilateral initiatives that were kicked off during the AI Impact Summit. So one of them was something called the AI Impact Commons. Right? This is upon stories about success stories of AI helping solve various kinds of social good problems in the global south. So this is not just anecdotes, but people actually talking about what worked for them, what did work for them. So and collecting this in a shared common repository, so that there is one place that to go to when you want to hear about what worked in other global south geographies and what we might adopt successfully in our own country. So that is one. And the second thing that also there was a multilateral agreement to set up is something called Trusted AI Commons. And this is a collection of tools. OECD is also doing a lot of work, and they also agreed to collaborate with the Trusted AI Commons in setting this up. And so the idea is that this will be a collection of various kinds of benchmarks, tools, best practices, and all of these for building trusted AI solutions for the global south, primarily focusing on areas that don't have a lot of resources. How would you build these frameworks for that, right? So, and I think these are mechanisms by which, like you said, knowledge sharing, alignment, and other things can happen. And the UN also has started off this network of capacity development institutes right? So this is again initiative where several member states are participating voluntarily. Unfortunately, it is still doesn't have the entire the General Assembly's approval, so it's still a voluntary effort. But already we are seeing a lot of. So I'm also involved in that discussions, right? And we are seeing a lot of very interesting conversations happening and commitments from research institutes across the globe to work together and also to exchange resources and ideas and so on and so forth. And I think several efforts that are happening. In fact, one might say there are too many efforts that are happening, and we need to at some point start consolidating some of these and making sure we get more bang for the buck. But it has to come from ground up. I don't know if the UN can mandate something to happen or any global body can mandate this collaboration. I think people should start building this up from the ground.
What a brilliant remark to get us towards the end of this discussion. I also want to highlight the World IP Organization, WIPO, has just launched the AI Infrastructure Interchange, and a network of experts is voluntary, is bringing multi-stakeholder experts from different nations, from different industry, civil society, to actually build that IP infrastructure cross-border, more from a tech perspective than a policy perspective, because every member state, they want to regulate and embrace this technology in the way better fits their society. But if there is an infrastructure, an IP infrastructure there is a fair exchange between countries, then the discussion of enforcement and collaboration becomes more possible. So definitely another of those initiatives to track, monitor, and understand the discussion and the development. And maybe to start with, any final remark, a few words from each one of you to actually remind us of the importance of these topics and a call for action. Let me start with Yuan. Yuan from China, what would you say? It's your final remark, just a few words. You're on mute.
Okay, thank you. And from the China perspective, I think actually there are three things are very important: the technology-based governance and the legislation framework, and the society trust. And only with these three things so that we can make the deepfake and the misinformation governance more effective, because it is different from the network era. The content is not just produced by the users and disseminated on the platforms. The AI actually have more technology, has more power, and has more speed, more quick speed. So
thank you.
So actually we have to put more emphasis to use more combined or complicated, more comprehensive approach to govern this.
Thank you very much. Let me quickly go through to Daniel.
Sorry, unmuting. So I think my closing thought is that rebuilding trust will not come from regulation or technology alone. I think it will come from how far we combine clear rules, practical safeguards, but also trusted human systems for verification and response. And I think we need to pay attention to environments where information moves very fast, which is often informally or even in local languages, where the cost of failure can actually be really high. So as we move forward, I would like us to focus not only on what's technically possible, but what's locally workable, equitable, and also accountable. Yes.
Brilliant, Daniel. Thank you. Let me pass it to Alan.
Yeah, I think what Daniel says, but maybe just to give us a special mention to the UN AI Trust and Safety Community, the cohort, I feel like, that's one of the initiatives I've seen where we have a lot of also technical policy, regulatory governments kind of brought together to have a discussion on AI, both on the opportunities side, but also on the harm side. And we need to embrace such type of collaborative approaches and figure out ways of supporting and making sure that that is at the center of everything that we do. I think that will push forward a lot of these conversations at the end of the day. Yeah, thank you.
Well said, Alan. And a final remark for Professor Ravindran.
I mean, Daniel, you put it really well. So, in fact, in the Indian regulation, if you look at it, we start off with the basic principle that says that trust is the foundation for adoption and success of any technology. And the entire framework that we have built is around how we use both technology, policy frameworks, and social structures in order to engender the trust. And of course, AI adds this additional complication because most of the AI producers, creators, if you will, AI creators are outside the legislative ambit of any of the people in the conversation today. So, and so it's always going to be a new journey trying to figure out how we can establish trust.
Indeed. Thank you all, distinguished panelists, and my fantastic co-moderator for this session, Nia Lang. It was a pleasure to have you all here to have this important discussion. This is only the beginning. It's evolving, and those kind of discussion and collaboration are critical to get us on a path where everyone is involved and is acknowledged for their contribution in the AI era. So thank you everyone again.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learnt something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the e-shop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for good.